Welcome to Recovery Corner, where the many pathways of recovery intersect. This is a space where you will hear personal stories of triumph in recovery, gain insights into various recovery-oriented systems, and learn how leaders across the country are building recovery-ready communities. The Recovery Corner podcast does not provide clinical advice.
Hi, friends. Welcome to Recovery Corner. My name is Jessica, and today we are talking with David Whitesock, founder and CEO of Commonly Well, also creator of the RCI. Welcome, David.
Hi, Jessica.
How's everything going?
I cannot complain. I have no complaints. How about you?
No, wonderful, wonderful. Recently, we've started using and partnering with you at Commonly Well and with your RCI. So I'm really excited to have this conversation and let people know your history and where this came from and how we're using it and how other organizations are using it.
Let's have that conversation. We're really excited that YPR is taking measurement at the scale that you're doing it, and it's going to be an adventure.
I think you have a really fascinating story. It's a little not typical. I love it. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and kind of where this came from?
Well, my professional background actually starts in the late 90s. I thought I was going to be an architect and kind of failed out of college and found myself in the radio profession. So I spent about 10 years as a radio DJ, AM talk radio show host, and play-by-play announcer for, you name the sport, I've probably, did play-by-play for it. And that career went on for quite a while. And I really thought I was going to, be a professional play-by-play announcer somewhere. But I was living kind of two lives. I had my sort of celebrity life, if you will. And then I had my addiction life. And I mean, most people that, after they heard me get better from that world, they knew there was obviously something wrong with me, but didn't have the space or time to deal with it. And so that career ended in the mid 2000s. And then I kind of hit reset on life simply because I ended up in a courtroom in a jail and after a fifth DUI. And my life was pretty terrible at that point. I was pretty sick. I was not well. But that kind of kickstarted a process with the judge who was like, I'm not going to take no for an answer. You're going to get better and you're going to solve this problem. There's a lot of details in there. But that eventually led me to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and then tangentially connected to an organization called Face It Together. I got sidetracked, went to college, got sidetracked again, went to law school, thought I was going to be a public defender. But of course, being a convicted felon made getting licensed pretty difficult. And so in that space of figuring out how do I become a lawyer and going through all the process of getting licensed, I ended up going to work for that organization called Face It Together. And it was in that organization delivering peer coaching, peer supports, where we had to figure out, how do you measure success? How do you know the people that are going through this program are actually doing well? And what are the contributors to that? And so that's the lead up to, let's dive deep into that rabbit hole and see where we come out.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's where you created RCI. Is that accurate?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about that? What was that? What was the tool? We're, assessing recovery, but what was the bigger picture?
Well, okay. So you've just asked probably the most important question, because we thought the bigger picture was this thing called recovery, right? But actually there were two things going on as we kind of were studying recovery, measuring well-being, those various things, measuring happiness, measuring thriving. Social scientists have been measuring quality of life for a long time. The bigger picture was kind of interesting because we were a little dumbfounded that social science had been measuring like the qualities of a person's life for a long time, but yet in addiction and behavioral health, none of those things really showed up at a meaningful way. Yeah. I think it was because we had a language that was kind of inconsistent with the language of quality of life. We talked about recovery. We talked about, which had its own definition. And so that was one part that we had to investigate. But the other part was, and this gets to the bigger picture, was if we're measuring one person and we've got 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people, does that give us the measure of the community? And so like you asked the question about the bigger picture, and it was like, well, maybe the bigger picture really is we have to measure the few to try to understand the many, and then we can get ahead of this problem.
That makes sense. A sociological perspective. It's it's looking at how the individual impacts the whole.
Yeah, it's sociological. And when we went down the road, we also started thinking in terms of anthropological. And when you have people and cultures and tribes and again, that collective idea. And what I choose to do today, even though we live in a very individualistic, society, what I choose today has great impact on 1, 10, 100 people in nanoseconds.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And we tend to forget that sometimes. And that goes in the reverse too, right? Like that stuff comes at us. So economists call that externalities, hit us, and either directly and we feel it and see it and know it, or indirectly. And we wake up one day and go, how did I get here? And it's because there was a massive social or cultural or other shift in the community, and you were just along for the ride.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a great point. So, you're working in there, you're creating this tool. How did that evolve? What was that evolution like from maybe this initial idea to what it grew into? And what were those milestones along the way?
Yeah. Well, the way it started, so I'll just give you the quick, how did we even get down this rabbit hole? We had a couple of our donors, funders, which were health systems. And we were very curious to try to get addiction care integrated into primary care. Like we wanted addiction care to be mainstream healthcare. And so the healthcare organizations were funders, and one of the CEOs was having a conversation with our founders and said, we love what you all are doing, and we're going to keep funding this. And we love the recovery stories that you tell. But if you really want to get into the healthcare flow, you're going to have some evidence. You're going to have some hard data. And that was the prompt. And so one of the co-founders, it happened to be a Friday afternoon, kind of here we are taping this. It was a late Friday afternoon. Everybody was gone from the office. It was just the two founders in the conference room and me out at my desk. And so Charlie walked over to my desk and he said, David, you've got 30 days. Figure out how to measure recovery. And that was I remember turning and looking at Charlie and saying, but Charlie, I'm 9,000 days sober. Isn't that the measure? And he goes, I don't think that is. And we had a little chuckle about that. And so we went down the rabbit hole. And so the milestones really were, one, I'm not a statistician. I wasn't trained in psychological statistics or sociological statistics. And I didn't even know how to put those words together, really. And so we had to, sort of talk to some experts. So we talked to people who actually create survey tools for a living. That was kind of part one. Part two was just literature review. And then, so that took about 6-8 months to kind of just sort of get our heads around that. The concept of recovery capital came up pretty quickly because we were very familiar with the work of William White and David Best and Dr. Alexandre Laudet and John Kelly and a bunch of others. And so, and then William Cloud and Bob Granfield, all the sort of the core people who've been working on recovery capital. And so we were familiar with that concept. And so then we had to just get like really conceptual. We had to just like ask bigger questions like, well, how do we measure, how is change measured globally and in other environments? And so we started looking at things like GDP, gross domestic product. That's how we measure whether or not a country is improving. Okay, it's in economic terms. So I talked to people at MIT and Columbia and places that work on those things, and Department of Labor and various places. And so you just had to pick up the phone and call people. And so we were just investigating for about the first year. And the next big milestone was looking at the one recovery capital instrument that existed at the time, and that was the William White recovery capital scale. And that was sort of the big milestone, because then we realized, well, that was just a yes or a no. And the questions were really tied to, are you drinking or not? And are you in 12 steps or mutual supports? And we were like, well, there's more to life than that. And if we just center on that's the definition of recovery or recovery capital, we're maybe missing something. So I think our biggest milestone was simply realizing and looking at other tools like the Social Progress Index as a big example and saying, wait, there's a broader framework of the holistic view of a person's life. And once we kind of jumped into that world, then it was, oh, okay, now what are the components? How do we define them? And then let's actually create our first instrument. Let's start putting some questions together. And that was a Frankenstein of a tool, because they were yes, no, give us a number, true or false, open text responses. It was a mess. There was no structure to it. And 121 or 127 questions to start.
So it's really been streamlined.
Yeah, I mean, what it is today, it started as really quite unworldly and unyieldy. It was hard to use. It was hard to understand. But we had people coming in for peer coaching on a regular basis. And so we had a natural place where we could develop this in collaboration with individuals wanting to change their lives. And we could just say to them like, hey, Jessica, we want to really understand how to measure your success. We've got this tool that we're developing. Would you like to help us? We want to take care of you first, but if you could give us 20 minutes later today, would that be okay? And almost everybody said, yeah, we'd love to. And so we just started testing it and started getting feedback. And that sort of led us down the road of, let's talk to a few other experts that do this. And next thing you know, we're getting it streamlined to 68 items. They're all statements, Likert scale, strongly agree to strongly disagree, scored calculation, and those sorts of things. So, yeah.
So let's dig into what RCI is today then. What is it measuring, and how do people use it? How can a participant understand their score and what to do with it?
So it is an index, meaning we are scoring various areas and basically ranking them, if you will, right? So, and it's in the concept of recovery capital. So for those that may not know what recovery capital is, it is the internal and the external resources that we can draw upon that can either help us start the recovery process or maintain it or hit the escape velocity and become something else. And so the Recovery Capital Index has 68 questions or statements, items. It's scored from 1 to 100. And we break it down into 3 main areas. And this is kind of important when we start to understand how we might use it in practice. The first area is personal capital. So think of the things that are really directly to you every single day, like job. Are you employed? And it's not so much are you employed or not employed. It's is your employment a place where it's a safe environment? If you're in the early days of recovery, is it okay to say that? And if you did tell your boss that, does that create greater harm or not? Like, you might love the job and you might need the job because you're on probation. But if it's a terrible, toxic place to go, that's a greater hit on your recovery capital than just having a job. Like, we've seen people have part-time jobs with greater recovery capital than people in early recovery with full-time jobs. And there's some research in Iowa that backs this up as well. So there's differences in that. So personal capital is transportation, financial well-being, your general health. So that's bucket one. Bucket two is social capital. Who's the tight-knit, close group of people that you spend the most time with, that have the most influence on you? Immediate family members, significant other, close friends. You can put coworkers in there too. And then, how does that network of people help you and support you, and how do you support them? And by the way, recovery capital got its roots from social capital. So there is a lot of weight there. And then the last one is what we call cultural capital. So this is really like cultural community capital. What's my relationship to the community that I live in? So it could be a geography. It could be my city or my town. It could be my culture that I live with, right? Or live in. And then it could be also, what's my purpose? So what is it that I am of this place? And so that's our cultural capital. And so we measure all of those. And there's indicators in each of those, and we just score those up. And so I have a recovery capital score of like 74 today. And then it's broken down into all those parts. And so once you know that as the individual, you have like, it's almost like stepping on a scale. It's almost like looking at your Apple Watch and saying, okay, how many steps did I walk today? If you will.
That's an amazing point. It's like a scale. Yes. And what I love about everything that you just said is that not once did you ask, when was the last time you used a substance, or really anything substance related? Because for me, and even, from a YPR perspective, you don't start over if you've used a substance again. You pick up where you left off. That scale did not start over again. You're picking up on what you already have accomplished, and it's not setting the restart button. And that's one big reason why RCI has really aligned well with YPR values. Is it's progress. It's just measuring that even when there's a minor setback, you're picking up where you left off. It's not as complicated as final as just talking about substance use.
Yeah, and I think there's two really important points in there. And the first is, our lives are made up of positive and negatives, right? And let's just take the person who's struggling with addiction or going through the recovery process out of it. Like, every single human being on the planet wakes up and either has a great day, an okay day, or a really, really terrible day, right? And we're all on that spectrum. And sometimes that lasts for multiple days, and sometimes it, could last for months. And so we all have these ebbs and flows. It's just natural. But the idea of hinging everything in terms of a person's success in relation to their substance use disorder or addiction on how many days are you sober? How many days did you not do a thing versus how much effort are you putting into improving a thing is a completely different mindset.
And not to mention the increased hope someone has when they're measuring something that isn't black and white. You're somewhere in the middle. It's not yes and no. It's I am right here, and that's good. And I have hope in that I can increase that capital.
Yeah. And even for some people to just inside they might be feeling like everything is falling apart. And then they sit down for 5 minutes, and basically the Recovery Capital Index is really a life inventory, is what it is. And when you sit down for a bit and you just kind of do this inventory on your life, and then you get this output of a score, like you go into it and I have this experience, even 17 years later, I'm having a bad day and I'm just like, oh, this is the wrong day to do it. I know how to game the system, but I'm just, whatever, I'm just going to do it. And it's going to be a bad score and it's going to ruin my average. And I say all of those things to myself. But I end up surprising myself, because really when I'm actually in it and I'm measuring it and the output comes back and it's like, okay, I am not as bad as my brain is telling me.
100% true. I took one, I have same experience. I took one, it was a bad day. I was being frustrated about something. I wasn't feeling well. It did lower I did have a lower score that day. But something about averages, one low average score is not going to bring down the whole score. You know what I mean? It's going to be weighted higher once you get back on track and are feeling better about those things or whatever it was, and your attitude has changed. And one bad day didn't tear it down, you know?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And so that kind of gets to the second really key point, and that is, there's very few people. It feels like there's a lot of people in our space that can stand up on a stage and tell their recovery story, and you see a lot of it. But just generally in society, that's actually very, very, very few people willing to do that. But there's just so many more people that actually go through treatment, go into rehabs, go into peer support programs, go to meetings, whatever that might be, are finding ways. Maybe they find a yoga thing that has nothing to do with recovery, or maybe it's with YPR, or they're doing something that improves their lives. And when you have an opportunity to sort of get to the collective of that understanding of what contributes to people changing their lives, now you get to tell a completely different story than what society has been telling about addicts and people in recovery for so long. Because we hear the normal narrative is, and typically it's because of a celebrity, right? A celebrity announces they're sober, skip ahead a few years, and we find out they're in rehab. And it's getting better, right? It's getting better now that what people come out and we hear these stories that people go in and out of treatment, and that's fine. But the broader narrative still isn't conducive to having a conversation about the complexity of what contributes to a good person's life. And so we can start to tell a different story and hit that stigma a bit more. And like with YPR, we can start to say, look, we're doing these things. We're doing these events. We're doing these community building exercises. We are using the data to talk to stakeholders and change makers to bring up the things that are necessary for resilience and to combat risk. Like we're taking, and now you can bring people into the solutions as opposed to just saying, no, that's a problem.
Absolutely. And that's one of the key reasons why YPR wanted a tool like this. We can not only assist our participants on an individual level, but be able to assess our chapters from what's the progress of your participants' RCI scores? What's that looking like? What are they engaging in? And if it's going great and there's increase, wonderful. If there's not, we can look at that and say, well, this is what other chapters are doing. Maybe you need to increase this thing that's happening in this other chapter to help your participants. So it's really an opportunity for us to make sure our programs are working for people and giving people a tool for their own recovery and to track their own story within this greater picture.
Yeah, that second part, the sort of organizational, information driven, let's do things that the participants are telling us they need. right? That's the other component to this is, and this is a double-edged sword, depending upon who you're talking to, whatever audience you happen to be in, but it's all participant reported, right? We're asking people to describe through a survey the observation of their life. And, you talked about sort of the law of averages, and that's what really applies here a bit, because some people are going to answer and over exaggerate their life experience. We all do it, and there'll be a little bit of that, but we can see those as outliers in the data, and we can assess for those or control for those. But at the end of the day, everything starts to come back to a bit of an average, and that says that we can sort of trust in the observation of the crowd a little bit, and use that for greater benefit.
Oh, absolutely. And something that stuck out to me with what you just said was, we're giving participants what they say they need, but also bigger than that, we would be able to give participants what is working as a whole. One thing that I found when I've taken the RCI is that it didn't really occur to me that a little bit of my low scores were things that I weren't even thinking about in my life or even paying attention to as potential issues. And that was fascinating to me. It made me think about how can I increase the score. Honestly, I don't even remember what that score was in now, but it really made me think about how can I improve on this area and what that impact would be. And so for participants, when they're going through this, and we are helping form our chapters and programs around what maybe people don't know they need, or maybe can't even articulate it yet.
Yeah. So, in particular, what we've found over the years is, and the way I like to describe it is, so many of us in the early days of our recovery process, we are 1,000-mile-an-hour bullet trains that are on fire. Like everything is just a mess. Everything is a mess. And you walk into somebody's room, or you're talking to another peer support person, and you're just like, nothing makes sense. It's just chaos, right? And like you said, what we can do with the RCI and even other instruments, other assessments, is we can sort of pause for a moment and say, well, you're telling me this story over here about like something that's really bothering you today because it's front burner, and you completely forget about all the other stuff. But then what we find out is when you sit down and actually do the inventory on other things, is like, oh, there's a few things over here that are small wins, or there are other fires that we can just kind of let burn in the field. We don't need to worry about those. Like this thing that you think is a big fire, actually, there's nothing we can do about it right now.
Absolutely.
And,
yeah.
and let's set that aside. I know you're really concerned and you want your kids back, but Department of Social Services operates under certain rules, and they're not going to answer the phone at 5:05 today. So let's deal with this one over here. And so we can really get kind of strategic in the way that we do problem solving, which I think for a lot of folks, they're just not, that's a learned behavior to start to train that. And then once you do it once, then we get to the position that you're in, where you're sitting yourself and you're doing that in your own head every 30 days or every 90 days or whatever that might be.
Totally agree. I think it's a really exciting opportunity for our participants to take charge of all areas of their life and be showing up to all the parts, the good, the bad, and embrace it, and have a ownership of all of the bits.
Yeah.
I think
there's ownership. There's, we start talking about psychology. Like, how do we get people to engage in their own intrinsic motivation, which is not willpower, but it's what motivates us to go do a thing. And sometimes people just need to be able to see that they are progressing, maybe not at light speed, but they are progressing, or they're just not going backwards. Like
Right.
even that knowledge is huge.
Yes, that will keep you sustained, in my opinion. I would feel very empowered that I'm feeling low. I'm feeling like I'm off the rails, but actually I am maintaining, and maintaining is okay right now.
In fact, if you're maintaining something that is reducing and eliminating negative consequences in your life and allowing you to just be in a position of starting or slowly progressing, you are winning the game. You're winning the overall game at life. Because all life is just figuring out, how do we just slowly progress?
Absolutely. And be happy doing it. It's about
Yeah.
being happy and living this life to our potential, and finding those moments of accomplishment that keep us engaged and striving for where we want to be.
Yeah. And, when, in our work together, our intention is to, one, measure recovery capital, but we also want to measure just sort of overall life satisfaction. Are people just moving along a scale of, like, as Gallup describes, going from a place of feeling like you're surviving to a place of struggle to a place of thriving. And it feels like that's a big jump from struggle to thriving. But really, that's kind of how life is, actually. We're kind of like in this day-to-day grind versus kind of being almost on a glide path. Like thriving starts to feel like you're gliding out in the air. And so we'll start to measure that over time too, and see what are the factors, quote, in recovery capital, that's getting this population of people to move through this process of change to a place of a thriving life. And then that learning can be transplanted wherever and however.
Speaking from experience, I can say that the distance between surviving and thriving feels like a lot until you've actually are in that moment of gliding and just and feeling successful. Once you're there, you look back and realize that wasn't that long ago. That wasn't that different. There's some key things that changed, but it wasn't that big of a leap once you're there. It feels like a lot when you're in the struggle mode, though.
It really does. Jerry Seinfeld has a joke about the distance between great and great. He's got like an ice cream cone or something. It's like, this is great. And then it falls over. Great. It's like one moment you are super happy, and the next moment you've lost your ice cream, and you're still, it's still great, if you will. Yeah. I mean, I think the key in all of that, though, is awareness. And that's what I think that's what we're trying to do here in this work, is to bring a little bit more awareness to people's state, to how they're feeling, how they fit into a broader context of the community, of themselves. And that just tiny bit of awareness can make a huge bit of difference. And it might not be measurable either, right? There might be things that we don't capture. And that's fine too, so we want to be sensitive to that, but yeah, just understanding a little bit more about the process, I think, is going to make a huge difference.
I totally agree. So we have this tool now, right? We have RCI as an organization. We've partnered with you to bring that. What do you see this doing in relationship to your overall goal? When you started Commonly Well, you had this goal and dream of making RCI more accessible, and now that's starting to happen. So how does this all play in together for you and where you're going?
Well, I think on the first level is doing something which we're now calling bringing greater recovery intelligence to more organizations, right? We just want to make more people intelligent. And that's really what this conversation has been about. So how are we making organizations like YPR intelligent in its work. Now, when we started talking about coming together, we actually were thinking of a slightly different framework, and that was, how do we make YPR evaluatable? Right? How can we get YPR to be in a place where at any moment, at any place in time, anyone who's a leader or somebody who has to stand up in front of a room and explain, are we successful? You'll be able to do that. And so that's part one, but the 10-year, 20-year goal is, I think, again, based upon this conversation that we're having, when we've got tens of thousands, millions of people that have been measuring the things that contribute to a life that basically protects them against addiction or substance use issues coming back into their life, one can posit that all of those things, if built on the front end, would keep addiction away in the first place. So, young people in recovery is about this idea that we want communities to be ready for people in recovery so that they're able to succeed well. But I think the reverse is true. I think if YPR is successful, that there are going to be people that'll grow up as kids and they're going to grow up in these recovery ready communities, but those communities are going to be immune from addiction taking a foothold like it probably has in some places. And so that's the broader state, is what we can learn is maybe we can start to package what we've learned, go to mayors, go to cities, go to places and say, I know you've been spending millions of dollars on like job training and all these other things, but actually that's not what the data says you should be doing. What it says you should be doing is this, this, and this.
That's such a great point. That is really an incredible point, to go to the root issues of substance use and try to navigate those in a way that they're not issues anymore.
Yeah, and be conscious of, and I'm super conscious of this, because it's pretty arrogant to say, oh, you're going to get rid of addiction. No. we've been doing this human thing for a while, and addiction has always been part of our human nature. We're not going to get rid of addiction. We're always going to have some our human brain is just wired to excess. It just is. But my feeling is, in some things just don't have to exist. Like I love listening to people's stories of redemption and recovery, but I'd rather not hear it. I'd rather people not go through that hell, not go through that horror, not go through those things. And so if we could just start to eliminate some of that a little bit more, eliminate more of the horror, eliminate some of the friction and the barriers and the things that just don't contribute to what I call a foundation of well-being in a community. Like, well-being should be the default for all. And how do we get to that? Like that's the conversation I hope in like 2 years and 3 years, when this project, when this work has been successful, and of course we continue to do it longer, but when we've got like a mass of information, we can go stand in front of a community or stand in front of a conference and say, this is the foundation. Like that really excites me.
It excites me too. It's changing the way that recovery is measured. And, not so long ago, we were talking about and researching the intersection between recovery or substance use and mental health. Now we're looking at it with so many more variables and so many more intersections to help advocate for increasing resources on and being able to get in front of the potential issues.
Yeah, what some people call being upstream, right?
Yep.
How do we operate as an upstream organization, upstream community, and realize that, and of course it's going to be challenging because there's going to be people whose businesses are built on the end state, right, of people going through that stuff. And we just be conscious of that. But I think all of us just want to make sure that people have the opportunity to live healthy and thriving and flourishing lives. But you got to start somewhere. And so here's where we're starting, and we'll just go for the ride and see what it becomes.
Well, I'm extremely excited to be partnering with you, David. I think this is amazing. And I think together we're changing some things and absolutely giving our participants an extremely valuable resource. So thank you so much for being on our podcast today. And thank you to all our listeners. Thank you so much.